I think the society must take every means at its disposal to defend itself against the emergence of a parallel power which defies the elected power in this country. And I think that goes to any distance. So long as there is a power in here which is challenging the elected representative of the people, I think that power must be stopped. I'm sure that, once again, with hindsight, you would have probably found it preferable if Mr. Cross and Mr. Laporte had been protected from kidnapping, which they weren't, because the steps we're taking now weren't taken. But even with your hindsight, I don't see how you can deny that.
No, I still go back to the choice that you have to make in the kind of society that you live in.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Jump in right away. Pierre Trudeau. I grew up as an Anglo minority in the working class area in Montreal called Verdun. Very blue collar, very working class. Verdun had a reputation. There you go. Verdun had a great reputation for sending the most people per capita to the Second World War, bar none. Verdun's working class roots were primarily Anglophone. Trudeau, for us, was the only one that seemed to comprehend the quiet revolution at what we perceived, and I still believe this, at the core of separatism, which is ethnocentric nationalism. Now I hear y'all now, oh, that's not true, there's democracy, but at its core, it really is about pure land. And Trudeau represented for us the only person that comprehended that. One of the things I remember about Trudeau when I was just a young lad was a fateful Saint Jean-Baptiste Day parade. Saint Jean-Baptiste Day parade, folks, happens only in Quebec. It's supposed to be to celebrate Quebec, but it has become a nationalist movement expression. There was Molotov cocktails thrown around where Trudeau was sitting along with Drapeau, and I think it was Robert Bourassa. Well, Trudeau pushed his security guards away when they tried to get him out of there. Bourassa had already left. Trudeau stayed right there, and that galvanized Trudeau in many of our, I guess, romantic, iconic symbolism of a person who stands up against great odds. Would you agree with that somewhat, John?
Yes. He was a man of incredible personal courage. Some would say recklessness. He would take on the biggest rapid. He would go to the Middle East when the war was on. He would go to China when the revolution was on. He would sit there while they were throwing bricks and all kinds of other things at him, and he never backed down on that. Don Johnson tells the story, the cabinet minister. He visited him in Nova Scotia, and there were a bunch of real rough guys, and they said, it's Trudeau, and let's get him. He turned around and just walked straight up to them, and they started to come at him, and they kept them coming, and they just backed back. He was a man of great, almost reckless courage, and he was that way in politics, too. He took chances. Getting to the second point, Trudeau in Quebec, he confronted separatism directly. He thought that Liberal government, of which he was part, was too soft on it. He thought, as you said, that it was a movement that was too much of an appeal to ethnicity, narrowness. He said, well, bring French power to Ottawa and make French Canadians proud of themselves, as it was being called. And he also argued there were lots of Francophones outside Quebec who had to feel part of a bilingual, bicultural country. country, and that's the way to look at it. So he was and remains a very controversial figure, but on the other hand, an iconic leader. He defined courage. He took on Quebec and defeated him. Canada is a country today, I would argue, because Trudeau was our Prime Minister. I don't think we would have survived as a country without Trudeau.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly on that. Folks, our guest today, John English, Just Watch Me is the name of the book. You can also go to the www.brenthollandshow.com website. As always, just click on the book cover. He had a vision of a just society compared to Kennedy's New Frontier. Can we talk to that?
I came out of that period, the 60s, when the whole Western world moved towards the left, and Trudeau represented that. He was on the left of the Liberal Party. He had been a New Democrat. He thought that inequality in society was wrong, and that capitalism in the post-war boom had created greater inequality, and that we had the tools to fix it. We are a much richer country than we were before, and those riches should be more widely shared regionally and also individually. A lot of it had been done during the Pearson years with the Canada Pension Plan, the student loans, the supplement for the old age assistance. But he expanded it and made it broader. A lot of the costs were underestimated, Medicare among them. But basically, it was a sense that we should be a more equal society. And during that period, we did become a more equal society. We've become much less so in the last 20 years. He contributed to it by his policies, but he was a man who was on the left, and like Kennedy's and Johnston's, the New Frontier, the Great Society. And one of the reasons was, of course, we were fighting against the communists who argued that they were building equal societies. Well, we had to respond to it. And so Trudeau's approach was a response to that.
Trudeau's approach was mostly dialogue, and it reminds me of Obama right now. His approach is dialogue as well. So perhaps I think it could be argued that he was a little bit ahead of his time, although Kennedy's approach very much was dialogue as well. I had interviewed Ted Sorensen several weeks ago, and we were talking about that approach as well. As much as
you're right about the analogy to Kennedy. Kennedy and Trudeau both were superb on television.
Oh, yeah. The charisma just rolled off them. Talk about the Beatles and Beatlemania. Holy cow. John English is our guest today, folks. Just Watch Me is his book, The Life of Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau, 1968 to 2000. We were just talking about Trudeau coming from the left, but as much as he was from the left, there's some surprises in this book, and I'm going to read one of those right now. He had no love for the UN, and I'm going to quote from the book. Trudeau had disliked the United Nations ever since he had served as part of the Canadian delegation in 1966. The General Assembly's raucous debates in the 70s, and in particular its condemnation of Zionism as racism, confirmed his low opinion of the organization. Now, this is important, this part. His aversion to terrorism intensified during the 70s after the October crisis, and we're going to get into that in just a few seconds, and the rise of urban terrorism in Europe as exemplified by the Bandor Menoff gang, and in the PLO massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics. I was surprised to learn that, John. I had no idea that he wasn't a big fan of the UN.
No, during the 1960s, he was sent there by Pearson, who thought it would educate him a bit on the international things, and he didn't like it. He thought it was indecisive, poorly led, and he thought the great powers were dominant.
Why was he so disliked by the West?
He put a lot of attention upon Quebec, gave a lot of money to Quebec, Alberta being the wealthiest province during the 70s, naturally resented it. And then it came the OPEC crisis and the oil crisis in 1973, and the election of Peter Lougheed. Before that time, the oil of Alberta was forced upon the province of Ontario because it was too expensive. Middle Eastern oil was far cheaper. So for development reasons, there was a line drawn which required Ontario to use Alberta oil. But then when the price soared, it was very different, and Alberta looked at it very differently. And Peter Lougheed came in and said, this is not Canada's oil, it's Alberta's oil. Within the cabinet, there were those who called for us to use the Peace Order and Good Government Clause and declare that oil a national resource, like uranium was, for example, during the war years. But that wasn't done, so it was a long series of negotiations that really went badly and ended up in the National Energy Program. And the National Energy Program was an attempt to share the money with all Canadians, and the province itself saw this being robbery, taking money out of their grandchildren's mouths. Trudeau became unpopular for that reason. And I think the other reason is he responded in kind. His famous saying, why should I sell your wheat? And there's no doubt that his focus was on central Canada.
Folks, this is a really good book. Every Canadian should own this book. It's called Just Watch Me, The Life of Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau. And talk about a guy with a chutzpah. He had balls, folks. The author, John English, there's many, many little anecdote things. John has gone to great lengths in terms of personal interviews with the family of Trudeau. www.brenthollandshow.com. Click on the book cover as always. Order the book. Let's talk now about the referendums, because these were also pivotal moments in keeping the country together. The first one took place in the early 80s. Can we talk to that?
Well, the referendum was the result of a decision made by Lévesque and Trudeau really to cool down things and try to make this a democratic decision. There were many in Canada at the time who thought that, for example, the historian Donald Creighton, who thought that this was absolutely wrong. We should literally march the troops in and finish them off. But Trudeau thought that we should allow a referendum, and he agreed to it in essentially the period 71, 72, 73 as the separatists were emerging in Quebec as a party. They, of course, competed in the election in 1970 and 73, and then, of course, won in 76. So in 76 they won, and they did emphasize the referendum, but they did say something would be held during their tenure. So they had 4 years. Trudeau was defeated in 79 in the election in the spring of that year, and Joe Clark came in, and Lévesque saw his opportunity, and he moved to hold the referendum. In one of those incredible flukes of history, Clark decided to go to the people. He thought he would win, I guess. And he lost the election, and Trudeau, who had retired, came back and led the Liberals to another majority government. So Lévesque was sort of caught short. The Separatists were doing very well in the polls, but then Trudeau comes in. Lévesque goes ahead with the referendum because it had been scheduled. And the result was Trudeau intervened in 3 famous speeches, the most famous one being in the Sauvé Arena, where he talked about, I am an Elliott, my family has lived in Quebec 200 years, I'm a Quebecer as much as anyone else. Taunted Lévesque, who had allegedly said that he was not a Quebecer, he was more an Elliott than a Trudeau. And it was a brilliant speech, but the very fact that Trudeau came back, and he came back with 74 or 75 seats in Quebec, which was a source of great strength, of course, and the referendum was won roughly 60% to 40%, 3-2, and it was his greatest win. From there he went on to, of course, bring in the Charter and the new Constitution.
Let's talk about the Charter as well. Our guest today, John English, the book Just Watch Me, we're talking about the life of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, 1968 to 2000, www.brenthollandshow.com. Click on the book cover. You can order it right online. Let's talk about repatriating the Constitution. Now, up until this point, there had been the Victoria Conference. There had been many, many conferences, folks. It was becoming a national joke. There were so many conferences. And finally, it seemed it was going to get done. The Night of the Long Knives. Can we talk about that as well?
Well, you've put it perfectly, Brent. There have been a long series of conferences going back, right into the 30s, but more recently, starting in 1967-68. Those were conferences which brought Trudeau to the foreground. He came to the foreground of Canadian politics because of his expertise in the area of the Constitution. He was a constitutional lawyer. He tried to get a settlement in his early years that led to the Victoria Conference. That Victoria Charter Conference fell apart when Bourassa went back to Quebec and seemingly in Trudeau's eyes welched on the agreement, showed weakness. Trudeau never thought well of him afterwards. When he came back to office in 1980, he decided he got this chance that was so unexpected. He had left politics, thought his career was over. He was really going to do what he wanted to do. So he pushed forward and decided he was going to go for what's called the Cadillac version of the Constitution. He brought it forward. He had the good luck to have 2 allies, Bill Davis of Ontario and Richard Hatfield of New Brunswick, both conservatives. But the other provinces were adamantly opposed, Lévesque, of course, most of all. And Lévesque got together with the other premiers and they came up with an agreement, essentially do it in and make it impossible. And it looked like Trudeau was on the ropes. So he decided to give it one last chance. At the conference, he really does outsmart Lévesque. He challenges him to a referendum. The other provinces were upset with the referendum because they thought it would win. Lévesque, he agreed, and then that falls apart. And that means the other provinces lose faith in what was called the Gang of Eight, and they start to work out their own settlement, realizing, of course, that Trudeau was going to go it alone. It would hurt their political positions because it was popular in the country at the time. And as a result, Trudeau went forward. The other provinces collapsed. Lévesque is left as an outsider and is very angry, and that is the Night of the Long Knives, the Long Knives being the ones where these other people plotted against them. But in reality, Lévesque had broken with them by agreeing with Trudeau on the referendum without consulting his people. It happened in public. And the Gang of Eight had fallen apart before.
Also, Lévesque had given up his right for Quebec to have a veto.
You're right.
And he always wanted that back, and Trudeau just replied, Rene, you gave it up. Folks, I should also mention in the book, and the book is called Just Watch Me, The Life of Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau, our guest today, John English. There's some amazing historical photos in there. And there's also one of my favorite all-time cartoons by Aislinn, who was the Montreal Gazette's cartoonist. And it's a picture of René Lévesque, and Trudeau is just to his right with his arm around René Lévesque. And it's quite obvious that the two of them had been involved in some kind of sexual activity, because René Lévesque's smoking. And the underlining comment is, René did the earth move. Oh my God, folks, it's hilarious to see that, because what can I tell you?
He's a great cartoonist.
Oh, Aislinn was
He's still in business, still causing trouble.
Absolutely. Again, folks, the book is outstanding. It's Canadian history. And through most of the tumultuous times, the Quiet Revolution, the separatist movement, the two referendums, and now, for the second part of the show, folks, we're going to go into the October crisis. Now, the October crisis took place in October in 1972, if I remember correctly, because I was just a kid. But I remember being so afraid. So afraid when the kidnappings took place. And we're going to talk about that whole scenario right now with our guest today. Just Watch Me is the name of the book, The Life of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, 1968 to 2000, and our guest, John English. John, can you start us off with the October crisis in Canada?
Well, during the 1960s, separatism in Quebec took a violent turn. Quebec's revolution, which some call quiet, but in many ways was fundamental in terms of the way that, for example, the most church-going society in North America became the least church-going society in North America within a little bit over a decade. That's astonishing. The government of Quebec secularized the education system, which of course had been church-based before. The role of the church in the healthcare system, and became a secular state. So it so often happens from one extremist swings to another, and some took up violence, including some who have been attached to Trudeau when he edited Cité Libre. Pierre was an editor, the editor chosen by them because he was a left-wing Roman Catholic. But he became one who espoused violence, as did Trudeau's best friend of his youth, well, his mentor actually, a former priest called Dubé, who wrote under the name of Hertel. Hertel wrote an article in 1964 talking about the need for André Laurendeau to be assassinated, and did not seem to rule out violence. And Trudeau broke with him on that, and he broke with Pierre Vabancourt, who had been his closest boyhood friend. So this was very personal. That's the point I'm trying to make. So we come up to the 1969-70. There have been bombs that have gone off that have killed people in the province. There have been thefts of weapons from various places, including armories. There was lots of calls for revolution, and then finally in October 1970, there was the kidnapping of James Cross, who was the British consul in Montreal. It stunned everyone. Trudeau reacted to it in the city of Montreal itself, as you were saying. There was terror. There was really terror in the streets. The police thought they were inadequate to cover it. Province called in the army to cover strategic places. At the universities, there were rallies, and there were rallies in support of the FALQ manifesto, which called for the release of the kidnappers. Now, Trudeau was opposed to it. He was opposed to terrorism. You mentioned the Jean-Baptiste event. So his mind was set. He knew these people. He knew them personally, some of them. So there's his mindset. And so in October 1970, Trudeau reacts strongly, but not as strongly as Jean Marchand, the former Quebec Labour leader, who was very upset and wanted to move very quickly. He thought the whole society was crumbling, as it does in a revolution. So that when Cross was not found, they considered, how do we counter this? In the meantime, of course, Pierre Laporte was kidnapped too. Pierre Laporte was a Quebec government minister whom Trudeau knew very well personally. He invoked the War Measures Act. The reason he did was that the argument was that there was no other way you could act quickly, try to arrest the people who mattered. There was little faith in the Montreal police. There was a sense in Ottawa that there was panic in Quebec, and that the government of Quebec was weak, and they were all too ready to negotiate. But what really turned Trudeau was a petition which Lévesque, Claude Ryan organized, and that petition was so irritating. It was signed by people who were close friends of his, like Marcel Rioux, Jacques Parizeau, who was a close friend who frequently had gone to dinner at his place, a great admirer of Parizeau's wife. So these people really burnt him by doing it, so it was personal. When they signed a petition calling, in effect, he thought, for negotiations, and even worse, he thought, to form a sort of a coalition government incorporating Lévesque and Claude Ryan, he just thought public order is disintegrating. He brought in the War Measures Act, and people were arrested who shouldn't have been. Cross was eventually released. Laporte was killed. kidnappers. Some of them were traded to Cuba, which was something that had always been promised, but they left the country, and others were apprehended and eventually served time when they came back. Trudeau's view, he had to do it. It established order, and it was the defense of a democratic principle. The Quebec government, the Bourassa government, had been democratically elected in this just before, and this undermined it. His argument was, when he wrote his memoirs in 1993, that Canada had lots of terrorism in the 60s. And this was an act of terrorism internationally noticed and on front pages everywhere. But after that, Canada had no more terrorism. Separatism went a democratic route. Now, Levesque saw it very differently, but Trudeau said Canada will settle our battles by the ballot box rather by the bullet, which was the case in so many other societies.
Folks, our guest today, John English, the book Just Watch Me, The Life of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, www.brenthollandshow.com. Click on the book cover, order it from the comfort of your own home. The consequences of bringing in the War Measures Act. Many people say it was very destructive to the country. I don't sit in that camp. I think it was the right thing to do. We're looking back now 40 years ago. How do you feel about it?
I'm in your camp, and I've been consistently in that camp, unlike most of my colleagues and good friends at the university. And the reason is what I said before. I think that there was no alternative to it. Number two, that I think there was certainly a clumsiness in execution, but did have the impact of breaking the momentum of what was a potentially violent and very destructive situation. Was replaced later by another act, and we haven't used it since. To be sure, there was a breach of civil liberties, no doubt about it. But there were many in the country, most in the country, I think, who were calling for something far more aggressive. Trudeau pulled back quickly. He regretted it afterwards. You can tell he's defensive in his tone, but he never got away from the sense of what was the alternative. How else could you have dealt with this? And could the criminal code have done it? I don't think so. And now we're in a much different age. We're dealing with terrorism in Moscow yesterday and Britain so regularly, and of course in the United States. The methods of Trudeau and what was done in the War Measures Act are much less severe than is done in Great Britain today. Tony Blair, both in the case of Ireland and both in the case of Islamic terrorism, brought in far, far more stringent restrictions of civil liberties than Trudeau did. I guess in a sense, Trudeau was unfortunately the forerunner, but in some ways recognized how fundamentally dangerous terrorism is to a democratic system.
There was a fundamental feeling in the city during this crisis, folks. I want to tell you, we looked for leadership on a local level. We looked to our mayor at the time, who was Jean Drapeau. There was no leadership there. He was a frightened, timid little man. We looked to Bourassa, who was the premier of Quebec at that time. And again, he seemed to be sitting on the fence, wishy-washy, uncertain of the direction to take. And everybody around him, René Lévesque, who was in the opposition at that time, as John just said, signed this document that more or less called for the appeasement and negotiations with the terrorists. The only person that stood up, and I want to make this clear for the students that are listening, that said no was Trudeau. Even though most of the people around him as well, I wouldn't say most of the people, but very many of the people in the federal system at the time were urging a more complacent term of negotiation, I guess I could say. Trudeau said, no, at times like this, you have to have nerves of steel. And I'll always remember him saying that. And the famous quote, he said, just watch me, when he was interrogated by a young CBC journalist. The journalist asked him, well, just how far will you go? And he basically just looked at him and he said, just watch me, as if to say, tell the terrorists right away, this is it, this is the bottom line. And Trudeau also felt horrible when the news that Laporte was found dead in the trunk of a car. He felt horrible that he may have made the wrong decision, or the decisions he made weren't wrong, but the decision he made led to the death of Pierre Laporte. I want to mention, too, that the perpetrators of these crimes are now teaching at the University of Montreal. So that says a lot about Quebec society, and I don't want to go down that road because that's not the focus of this show today. The focus of this show, of course, is John English. Just Watch Me is the name of his book, The Life of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, 1968 to 2000. This was a man of vision, folks, Mr. Trudeau. He started a peace initiative when most of the governments around him in the 80s were conservative governments. You had Reagan, of course, that was in the United States during the 80s, and Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain. Could we talk a little bit about the animosity between Margaret Thatcher and Pierre Trudeau and what led to that?
Thatcher, the Iron Lady as she was called, actually had an attracted Trudeau. He liked her. He thought she had a lot of guts. And on the Constitution, I think I quoted in the book, should we send out thank you notes to Premier Blakeney and Premier Lockheed, whatever. He said, if I were advising the House of Commons, I would give my thank you to Margaret Thatcher. She had a lot more guts, and that's not quite the word he used, than they did. But she was a little upset about the Constitution as it developed. She didn't realize there'd be so many complications. But where they fell apart was on international politics. The reason they did was that Pierre just did not like the very hard line that she took towards the Soviet Union's and international situation more generally. They fought at the G7. By 1984, they had argued so often at his final meeting in June 1984 of the G7, he kept putting up his hands and she wouldn't recognize him. She just wouldn't let him talk, and she would not recognize him at his final meeting as a person who was retiring. Usually he was, as always, acknowledged the person was retiring, and therefore he should be honored, and she wouldn't do it. She was a tough woman. Reagan went over to him and said to him, Pierre, I want to thank you. I've enjoyed you. You're a dear friend. And he did it loud enough that everybody heard. But as far as Thatcher, she just would have no time for him at all. And she didn't like his economics. She thought he was too far on the left. He represented everything she came to distrust, too soft in the Soviets, too much in love with the developing world, because the developing world looked, the third world as it was then called, looked to Trudeau for leadership.
What do you think his lasting legacy is?
Well, very obviously the Charter is a huge one that will be here for generations, and that's how he's mostly remembered. And it does symbolize his sense of Canada as a part of the individual and their rights, and it has transformed Canada. And secondly, I think, as I said earlier, the fact that Quebec is within Canada, and as of this moment it seems separatism is certainly not dead. It's the opposition party in Quebec and the largest number of federal members, but no one seems to be thinking that there's going to be the kind of breach that would have occurred in the 60s.
I would be amiss if I didn't mention John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Yeah.
Could we talk about when they met with Trudeau?
John Lennon was banned from the States at the time because of a drug offense. They were going to have a peace love-in at one of the hotels in New York, Park Plaza there, so they did the hotel in Montreal. They were asked to see the Prime Minister, and he agreed to see them for a few minutes and went into a longer interview. And John and Yoko were struck by Trudeau, who talked about the need for peace, how bad nuclear weapons were, and when they came out, they said they found a man who would change the world. They took to each other, and Trudeau had a way of attracting celebrities, and he too was attracted to celebrities, as pointed out in the book, and he was intrigued by what made them celebrities and what charisma was. He liked people who stood out from the crowd.
He also dated Leona Boyd, who's a very famous classical guitarist here in Canada, and Barbara Streisand, folks. Our guest today, John English, his book we're discussing, Just Watch Me, The Life of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, 1968 to 2000. John, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. We're going to have to start to wrap up now, but I'm going to ask you a question I ask every guest on the show. You are virtually speaking to every university student in Canada, international students as well. What would you say to them?
Well, I guess I'll speak to a former professor. Study. Work hard. You know, you're at university for such a short time, but it's such a great advantage in life. And I realize when I meet my former students, and I've got so many of them now, they look at it with, it's just a very precious moment. So treat it preciously.
Perfect. Again, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks very much, Brent.
You know, I didn't always agree with Trudeau. Nobody walks on water, but when it came to fighting separatists, he stood strong and firm in a sea of jellyfish, and I will always be grateful for that.
I think the society must take every means at its disposal to defend itself against the emergence of a parallel power which defies the elected power in this country, and I think that goes to any distance. So long as there is a power in here which is challenging the elected representative of the people, I think that power must be stopped. I'm sure that, once again, with hindsight, you would have probably found it preferable if Mr. Cross and Mr. Laporte had been protected from kidnapping, which they weren't, because the steps we're taking now weren't taken. But even with your hindsight, I don't see how you can deny that.
No, I still go back to the choice that you have to make in the kind of society that you live in.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.